City for about 10 years. And he taught knitting and crochet, sometimes crochet, felting, embroidery, dyeing. He was one of the teachers for the Knitting in the Round class that you are all taking today. Like he said, we do have a lot of material to cover, so if you want to follow along with a handout, that's great. We're going to be going kind of quickly, but we'll try to demonstrate things at least twice. I'll be hanging out in the chat to answer any questions there and to forward them to Darren as well. Just so you know, this is Intro to Knitting in the Round, so you do already need to know how to knit and probably how to purl and cast on. We will not be covering those skills. All right, Darren.
Okay, well, let's get started. A little bit about knitting in the round, though. Knitting in the round, maybe not, yeah, okay, that's better. Knitting in the round is very much the same as knitting flat. The stitches are created the same, and the basic theory is exactly the same. But one special thing about knitting in the round, which makes it really great, I think, is that you're always working on the right side of your work. So as you can see, I'm knitting here, and I'm looking at the right side of my work, and as I turn it to knit, it never goes to the back side of your work. You're always working on the front side of your work. So that changes things, because if you want to make stockinette stitch, now knitting in the round, instead of knitting one row and purling one row, you just knit every row, and that creates stockinette stitch. So that's completely crazy compared to knitting flat. That sounds like you're in upside down world. If you want to make garter stitch when you're knitting in the round, now what you have to do is knit one row and purl, or knit one round and purl one round. So it's just pretty much the opposite as when you're knitting flat. Why I think that's really great, knitting in the round, you're always looking at the front of your work, is because later on, if you learn how to do different techniques like fair isle or cables, or if you're working on lace or brioche, they're quite different from the front and the back. And sometimes when you're working on the back of those techniques, it's easy to make a mistake because you can't really see what it's supposed to look like. But with knitting in the round, because you're always looking at the front of your work, it's easy to see what you're doing, and it's easy to see if you've made a mistake, and you can fix it quickly. So I really like it. I really love knitting in the round. Some things you can do with knitting in the round, basically you're making tubes. And what's shaped like tubes when you're knitting? Like, what do you need tubes for when you're knitting? But that's everything. Sleeves of a sweater are a tube. Fingers for your gloves are a tube. A hat is just a tube with one end sealed up. Socks are just a tube. So once you learn how to knit in the round, you can make all of these things. So getting started, I'm just going to show you a little bit first what it looks like to knit in the round, and then I'll show you how to get started. So that way you kind of see what's happening, and then you'll see how to actually start it. Okay, so if we want to go to the close-up of my hands. All right, so it's a good idea to put a stitch marker on the beginning so you know when you ended a round or when you're beginning the next round. Okay, so you always put a stitch marker to mark your beginning, and then it's pretty much the same as knitting. However you normally knit, you would continue to knit the same way you normally knit. So there's, once you get it started and once you get it going in the round, it's really very easy. It's just kind of getting it started, which is kind of the trick, right? So that's knitting in the round. And one thing also, it becomes very important when you're selecting your needles, when you're knitting in the round, that you don't pick a needle that's too big. So for this needle is 16 inches round. And so you can't knit a circle that's smaller than 16 inches. So if you're trying to make a sock or a baby glove or a baby booty or something, you couldn't go smaller than that. You couldn't do it on this because it's too big. And the reason you can't is because you can see the stitches would get stretched out around this so tight that it would be impossible to work with. So sometimes when you're knitting in the round, one of the most important times to do it, one of the most important things you need to learn how to do is to make a smaller tube. So on the 16-inch circular, you can keep going on. And then if you were making a hat and you start your decreases for the hat, for the crown
Hi,
shaping.
Darren. Sorry, we're having audio issues again. Can you
Okay, sorry.
move closer to the microphone? Yes. And then we've got some people confused because you're starting with things already on the needles. So I just want to make sure that you know we have a lot of interest in how do you start and then join in the round. I know we'll get to that, but we're going to reassure everyone.
Okay, so yeah, I'll get to that here. I'll try to get to that real quick. But what I wanted to say was when you're making a hat and you work your hat on your 16-inch circular needles, and then when you start your crown shaping, the hat is going to become too small to work on to continue with. So that's when you would want to switch to double pointed needles. And double pointed needles will give you the opportunity to make the hat smaller and smaller and then finally close up the top. So that's the time when you would switch to double pointed needles. And I'm going to show you how to switch to your double points because this is where you're really going to use double points mostly. So basically you just pick up your double pointed needle, and it's called a double pointed needle because it has a point on both ends. And if it makes you nervous that there's not a stopper on the end, what you can do is you can buy these point protectors and just pop them on there, and that'll keep your yarn from slipping off. And then all you do is you just start knitting with your new needle right from your old needle, and you will continue until you transfer all of your stitches to your double points. And just keep going like that until you transfer them all. And what you're going to do is you're going to end up using 3 double pointed needles to make this circle. So, and then you pick up your next double point and you put your point protector on it, keep it safe. And then you just let the other one hang out, pretend it's not even there. If it gets in the way, you can move it down. Dropped my stitch. Oops. So I have a hard time looking through the camera and knitting through the camera lens instead of actually looking at my knitting. So I'm trying to learn how to do that. I feel like I'm all thumbs when I do that. Hopefully. And then as soon as I'm done this, I'm going to show you how to start in the round. So I'll show you how to get started in the round. But this is the thing that your beginners especially are going to do most. They're going to start with double point, or start with 16-inch circulars for a hat, and then transfer to double points once you get. So you see how I just knitted so many on each one, and now.
That's a good question, Darren. How many do you know how many stitches do you know how to put on each DPN?
Usually I try to divide it out fairly evenly. So if I have, if I had 30 stitches, I would probably put 10 on each one and have 3 double pointed needles. It doesn't have to be exactly even, but if it's fairly balanced, it does tend to make it easier to work with. So once you get all of these transferred onto your double points, almost got it. And then I'll show you how to get started. But the reason I wanted to start it this way was because sometimes people, when I've taught this class in person, the question was, well, why do we need to learn how to do this anyway? Like, when am I ever going to use double pointed needles? And so making a hat is one thing knitters love to do. You can make hats for gifts, you can make hats for quick projects. And so you can see now I am only using 3 double pointed needles, and you'll just continue to knit and follow the pattern decreasing as instructed, and that it'll keep closing and get smaller and smaller and smaller until you've closed up the crown. So that's probably the most often you'll use double pointed needles, really, is closing up the top of a hat. So, and then you just pull them out whenever you're done.
While we're talking about double pointed needles, Ronnie has a good question. Why do you need 3, and could you just use 2 double pointed needles?
You need 3 because you need it to go, you need to be able to go around. So 3 will help you create a circle. So it looks like a triangle, but you'll be going around in a circle. If you only have 2, then the needles will be held parallel to each other and you wouldn't really be able to do it. You can try and see how you feel about it. I'm sure you probably could force it to happen, but it's not going to be like a good experience for you. When you work with them and actually try it, it'll make more sense why you need 3. When you buy double pointed needles, they usually come in a pack of 5. For small projects, I only use 3 needles, and then the 4th one I knit with, and then the 5th one I just keep as an extra one. All right, so what I'm doing now is I'm getting started a new project on my double pointed needles. And so if whatever the pattern says to do, if it says cast on 10, cast on 50, you just cast all of your stitches all on the first needle. I'll just put my yarn. So you just cast all of your stitches on one needle. So now I've got my cast on one needle. I've got my point protector so it doesn't slip off the end. And then what you can do is divide them onto your 3 needles. And sometimes the pattern will tell you how many to put on each needle. Sometimes if you're working a sock, you'll have a certain number of stitches for the heel and a certain number of stitches on for the instep, and you might not you might have a lot on one and not so many on some of the others. But if it's going to be like that, the pattern will tell you. Other than that, I like to keep mine fairly balanced. I'm not even really counting these. I'm just going to look and see if it looks balanced, and that's good enough. And starting knitting in the round, getting started is the same on all of the techniques that we're covering. So what you do is you cast on, and it looks like a big mess. It looks very confusing. So that's normal. And you want to lay it out like this just to make sure that everything looks all right. Now what you want to double check is, let me try to lift it without it turning too much. You want to make sure all of your stitches are facing the same direction. This is very important. So all of your stitches should be facing the same direction. You don't want to see a twist like this. Like you can see they're not all facing the same direction. So you want to double check, make sure they're all facing the same direction. Otherwise you'll have a twist in your work. And once you set that twist in, you can't fix it. You'd have to rip it out. And it happens. I've done it. We've all done it. And it's no fun, but you know, sometimes things happen like that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go around in a around this triangle. I'm going to use this working yarn, and I'm going to join to this stitch right here. And once we join to that stitch, we're going to work across each needle one at a time, and that'll complete our round. So all that being said, we're going to put, it's a good idea to put a
Good question, Darren. When you're working on the double pointed needles or when you're casting on, does it matter which needle tip goes over which, sort of like how they're interlaced?
Um, I don't think if I'm understanding what you're asking, it doesn't really matter. Just however it's easy to hold in your hand, whatever's the most comfortable. I think I,
Yeah, I usually try to have mine oriented the same around the entire piece. So if you know the end, you can't see me, but I'm making air quotes, the end of one needle is above the tip of the next, then I make sure it's that way all the way around. And I just think it helps keep the tension more even.
yeah, good. All right, so I have them here in a, lay them out kind of like that again so you can see. If you lay it out kind of a C shape, if you lay it out in kind of a C shape to make sure your stitches are not twisted, and then when you pick it up, you're going to hold it in the shape of a triangle. Keep your tail out of the way. Put your stitch marker on. Oh, I'm going to put it there. Don't put your stitch marker on yet. And you're going to use your working yarn, not your tail. And you're just going to start knitting. It's going to feel really weird, but it's really just like normal knitting. So this is my 4th knitting needle. So the 3 knitting needles that are holding your work, you're only using one of those knitting needles at a time. And the other 2 knitting needles are just holding your stitches and they're just waiting their turn. They're just resting. All right. So I'm going to use my 4th knitting needle and they're all just exactly the same. I'm going to enter my stitch just like normal, the first one. And I'm going to take my working yarn that's coming from over here, and I'm going to knit that stitch. Now, the only thing you do different here, once you've knitted that stitch, you want to pull it a little tighter than normal, and that will help keep your tension nice and even. And then you're going to knit the next stitch. And so maybe for the next stitch, give it maybe a little snug too. You don't want to pull it too tight and get crazy, but a little extra snug, okay? So now you can see all I'm doing is just working across the needles, knitting every stitch just like normal. So the only thing that you need to worry about is starting at the beginning, making sure that it's not twisted. And if it was twisted, we have one more chance to fix it. So don't panic at this point. What's wrong with that one? Fix that. Okay. Okay, so now I'm getting to the last 2 stitches on this needle. Okay. So I've knit the last stitch on my first needle. And what happens is this needle now becomes free. It doesn't have any stitches on it. So this was one of my original 3 stitches when I cast it on. And so now that one becomes your working needle. And so you can take this opportunity to kind of reposition things in your hand, to kind of sort things out, make sure everything's just the way you want it. Get your working yarn positioned. Now, the way I like to do this, I like to push my needles down because then they're not in my way. However it's going to be, so like this one too, I like to move it out of my way. So however you want to hold it's fine. It doesn't really matter. Now I'm just going to enter my first stitch like normal with my working needle. The other 2 needles are just resting and waiting their turn. And then you knit, and then you put maybe just a little, give it a little extra snug, nothing crazy. The second one, you can give it a little tug. And then now it's just knitting like normal. You're just doing what you know how to do. And it's a good idea to cast on and practice. Like, don't start a project. Don't be like, I'm going to make socks. And that's your first time ever trying it. So you don't want to do that. You give it a good practice. So now I'm at my last stitch on this one. And you just knit that last stitch off. The last one wants to be treated the same as everybody else. And then now this needle becomes my working needle. And so you rotate it clockwise. And if you want to, you can take a minute to get everything lined up so that it looks like it's making sense in your hand. And then this last needle, at the end of that one, is kind of very important. So I'll show you what goes on there. So you knit across this last one. Okay, so that's our first round done. We've done one round, we made it to the end. Okay, and so if you shape it like this into a triangle, you want to double check, this is the last time you can do it. You want to double check and make sure your stitches are not twisted. And make sure they're all facing the same direction. So face them all inside like this, and they're all going in a nice straight line. Does that make sense? And then if they're wrong, at this point, you can still fix them. If it were, say it was twisted like that. So if it were looking like that, that's wrong. So we can still fix it because we're only attached by one strand of yarn. So now that I'm right, I feel like I did it right. I'm going to pick up my working needle. And now is the time I'm going to put my stitch marker on because it'll stay there now. Well, no, actually. I'm going to knit my first one. And then you put your stitch marker on so it doesn't fall off the other end, right? And then you knit your second one, give it a little snug. And then now on this row, you're just going to continue knitting just like normal. You can relax. It is going to feel really fussy and really fiddly having those other needles just hanging out, but you kind of get used to them. You kind of get used to the fact that they're there and they really don't bother you after a while, believe it or not. I do recommend for beginners that you use wooden double pointed needles because they're much less slippery, and the metal ones can be quite slippery and hard to keep your stitches under control. Okay, so this is what we're looking like. This one I did in my second row on this one. My working yarn is coming from that needle and going from here to there. I turn my work clockwise, so I'm kind of working counterclockwise, but my work turns this direction, and I'm going to start my next needle. This is my working needle, and this is my needle with the stitches, and this is just like normal at this point. All right, so while I'm doing this, do we have any questions, Claire?
We do have a couple questions. I think our most popular one is, how do you prevent laddering, or how do we prevent gaps between the two needles?
So that's always the problem that you do face, is the laddering and the gaps. And there are a couple of different ways you can correct them. Giving your stitches that, maybe the first 3 stitches even on the needle, pulling them a little extra tight, that will pull that gap closed, and that'll help close it for you. If that doesn't work, and once I knit another round, I'll demonstrate it, you can shift the needles, or I'm sorry, shift the stitches on your needles so that the gap isn't always between the same 2 stitches. And that probably doesn't make any sense, so I'll show you how to do it.
Oh yeah, that's a good tip. Yes. So basically your gap is never at the same point for more than one round.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I'll do it every 2 or 3 rounds. When I was first learning, I would do it.
Depends on how much extra work we want to put in.
Yeah. So now that I've finished that round, because I am getting a gap there, I'm going to reposition my stitches. So I'm just going to very fussy, isn't it? One only has a couple. So I'm going to put off the back of my these back there. This needle only had a couple on it. And then at this point, instead of using my working needle, I am going to knit with this needle to shift my gap. So I'm going to knit with this needle. So now I'm only knitting with the 3 needles, just for a couple of stitches. I'm only going to knit like 2 or 3 stitches past it. So you usually don't. And so now I'm going to take my working needle and start. And what I've done is I've shifted my gap. Instead of this was where the gap used to be. I moved that over, and so this is where my new gap will be. And that helps to prevent the laddering. And if the ladders are really bad, then you might want to, keep practicing. But if you don't notice them very much, you'll be surprised after you wash your item or block it wash it a couple times or block it, then the tension will even out if it's not like real horrible. Okay, so usually I would start knitting with this needle because it's my working needle, but because I want to shift my gap, I'm going to knit 2 or 3 stitches like this. And don't forget, knit across the whole needle, or else you'll have to fix it.
Yes, then you're going to run into problems.
Yeah, you'll have to fix that.
And I just want to mention, while you're moving the stitches around, you've kept your stitch marker for the beginning of the round in the same spot.
Yeah, don't move your stitch marker. And if you have stitch markers marking other things, like where the gusset of a heel starts or something, you don't want to move your stitch markers. Just keep them in place. Okay, does this make sense to everyone? Is it a?
I think so, yes. We're getting a lot of talk about how we all manage multiple needles, and I always say at least the first couple rows, if you're starting directly on double pointed needles, I always feel like I'm wrestling with a hedgehog.
Yes, but they're not as cute.
No, they're not as cute. Let's see here.
See here, I'm pulling my stitch really tight, and that closes up the gap. But you don't want to let it be crazy. You're not trying to ruin your tension. So. Okay.
Oh, and Gail had a question. How do you know when you're knitting around on double points, on circulars, whatever? How do you know where you left off if you stop your knitting in the middle of a round?
Well, if you feel like that's going to be a problem for you, then I would always try to stop it at the. You mean if you stop mid-round, or if you stop at the beginning of the round?
Like if you have to go answer the door, just put your knitting down. How do you figure out where you are?
Well, if you stop, you'd have to maybe, if you're following a pattern, just mark on the pattern where you are, or when you come back to it, you can look at your knitting, and so like if this said to knit stockinette stitch for 10 rounds and I don't know where I was, you could count your stitches and see where you are. Or if you were knitting a pattern and it was like knit 2, purl 3, knit 1, purl 6, you could count your knits and purls and kind of see where you are in the pattern. So you just kind of have to look at your knitting and read it and kind of figure out where you are. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and then Sherry had a follow-up, how to make sure you're going in the correct direction once you pick your work back up.
Well, that's a very good question. So I put my work down, pick it back up, and this is right. So what you want to make sure, once you've started in the round, your working yarn should always be coming from the right. You're going to be working into this left-hand needle, and also most important, I'm making stockinette stitch, so I'm looking at the front of my work, right? If you pick it up backwards, okay, so now I'm picking it up, I'm going to do it wrong. So my work, this is coming from my left-hand side, so that's your first mistake. But one thing that should really help is, see, like now you have to turn it inside out to work on it. And I'm not looking at I'm not looking at stockinette stitch anymore, I'm looking at reverse stockinette. So if I go to make my knit, you can see that. If I go to make my knit stitch, I'm entering my stitch to make a knit, but I'm looking at the stitches next to it, I can be like, oh, that doesn't look right. So stop what you're doing and then reposition it. But if you're doing a reversible fabric, like like knit two, purl two, rib, then it's much easier to make that mistake. So when you pick up your work, kind of sort it out so it looks right if it was twisted or if anything was looking funny. And then just always make sure that your working yarn is coming from the right hand needle. That's really the trick. What do you think, Claire? Is that the best way?
Yes, I think most important thing to remember is when you pick it back up, your working yarn should be attached to the needle in your right hand.
Yeah.
If you're knitting right-handed, which most people are, yes. Funny fact, when I first learned to knit double pointed needles, I knit everything inside out for my first few projects because I didn't know that.
Okay. All right, so do we feel pretty good about, so what we talked about starting on a 16-inch circular.
Yes, I think we have people wondering how we start on the 16-inch needles. So I want to make sure we have time for that since we're about halfway through class.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to cast on for that because I wasn't.
Uh-oh.
It's really the same when you start all of them. You lay it out in the shape of a C and make sure your working yarn is coming from the right-hand side. And then let me cast on real quick. Well, I'm casting on real quick and I'll demonstrate that. Are there any other questions we could talk about?
Let me scroll through the chat here. We did have a question a while ago about casting on an extra stitch. And I know some patterns recommend that to help like close up the gap between the first stitch and the last stitch.
Yeah, what do you do with that? Then you knit two stitches together and it pulls it tight? I've never really.
Either knit two stitches together or bind off that extra stitch. Personally, I just use begin my cast on tail to sew that up, so.
Yeah, that's what I've always done. A lot of times people have all these great solutions for all these problems, but really the solutions tend to be a lot more work than the problem ever was. Just use your tail to sew it up, and that's going to be that.
Yeah, and you know, practice, you'll find out what works best for you.
And that's one of the best parts about knitting too. Like, if it works best for you, then that's great. And if somebody else doesn't like it, then they can find a different solution. There's so many different ways to accomplish the same thing.
Oh, we did have a couple questions specifically about purling on double pointed needles, but you could apply it to circular needles as well. Wondering if you have any tips to make it easier or if you do it the same way as you would in straight knitting.
I do it exactly the same. Once I set up my circular knitting, if I'm doing it on double points or if I'm doing it on circulars or however I'm doing it, I always just make the stitches the same way. Do you do it different, Claire? Is there a different?
No, I do it the same way. I think sometimes in a smaller circumference, it can feel a little more awkward, especially if you're working on double pointed needles and trying to move all those extra pointy bits around. But technically the stitch is made the exact same way, whether you're knitting in the round or knitting flat back and forth.
All right. So now what we're looking at here, I cast these on very quick. So I'm starting a hat. So let's pretend I'm starting a hat. And so you lay it out like this in the shape of a C. So same as the double points, they were kind of like shaped like that. You want your working yarn to be coming from the right. And don't knit with your tail. That's always fun when you knit with your tail and have to start over. So, and then you pick up your circulars and kind of get it positioned ready. The left hand shouldn't have any, it doesn't have the working yarn, but the right hand has the working yarn. That's the most important thing if you're ready to join. And you can see all of my stitches are facing the same direction. If they weren't, it might look like that. See how there's a kind of a twist. They're not facing the same. So you want to kind of sort that out right away. Double check. And then the problem with this is it's so easy. You feel like there should be something special, or there should be like some magic word or something, but it's really not. You just pick up your yarn and you just knit that first stitch just like normal. And then the only special thing is give it a little extra snug. And then the second one, the second stitch is the same. Maybe give it a little extra snug. And then at this point, I just knit like normal. And if you're knitting a hat, you probably start with a rib. So I'll show you how to do it. Because the knit and the purl, it's exactly the same there. So the knit stitch, what I've been doing, and that's how I do it. For purl, you open your needles, bring your yarn in the right position for purling. And then you just do it. And it's exactly the same. Nothing, the stitches don't change. It's just kind of the way we're approaching them. Any questions about that? Do you want to see it again?
I would say probably see the join again. And I don't know if you mentioned what size needles and what yarn you're using here, just in case.
Okay, yeah. So I'm using Pound of Love from Lion Brand, and that's available on michaels.com. And I think I have a size 9 needle, a size 8 or 9. Doesn't really matter so much as long as you're using the right needle that'll get you the gauge that you want. So the pattern should usually recommend a needle to start with. And then you just want to make sure you're using the right needle to give you the right gauge. I like wooden needles best. I love a wooden needle. Other people like metal needles. Some people like plastic needles. I know some people that only like birch. They don't like bamboo. So, you know, it doesn't really matter the needle you pick. All right. So I unknitted that.
Well, now that you brought that up, why do you like, oh, sorry, Darren. Why do you like the wooden needles?
I just like, they're not as slippery. I really don't like the slippery metal ones. I think that's why.
Oh, someone pointed out also, you forgot your beginning of the round marker. We have very eagle-eyed students.
Well, I'm not really making a project though, am I? So it's probably fine for just this little swatch. So I'm going to pop this marker right on here. Oh, and here, that's a good point. That's a good thing to mention. If you do forget your marker and you don't remember for like maybe you've been knitting for an hour talking to your friends and then you realize you didn't put your marker, you really have a built-in marker for the beginning. So wherever your tail is, that's where your beginning is, and that can act as your marker. So when I'm knitting, I usually don't even use a marker. I usually just use the tail as my guide. But for beginners, or it's a lot of people like to use a marker because, you know, it makes them feel like they're keeping track of it. So whatever you're comfortable with is fine. So I'm going to lay that there. So you lay this out in the shape of a C. And remember, there's really not much to remember. So when you go to do this, you'll be like, what was that crazy thing that had to happen to make this work right? Well, there really isn't one. There's really nothing crazy, nothing magic. So you would just want to double check and make sure all of your stitches are facing the same direction. Okay. And you pick up your left hand needle. There's no working yarn attached to it. You pick up your right hand needle. Your working yarn is coming from your right hand needle. That's very important. If you want to use a stitch marker, you can pop your stitch marker right on there now. I like to kind of scoot some of my stitches up on my needle so they're ready to go. They're not joined, right? And then once you knit, and if you think about it, you know, you're taking this yarn and joining it to that. So it's really not any, you know, it's not like a trade secret or anything. And then you just join. Let me do it close to the camera. So not joined. And then you just, now it is joined. And just give it a little extra snug, a little snug, not anything too tight. Knit the second stitch, maybe give that a little extra snug. And now you're just knitting or purling or whatever as normal. So nothing, the only thing that's new is you're only ever working on the front of your work. You're not working on the back. You're not working front and back. You're not turning your work over and knitting, on the other side. You're not switching hands. Like when you're knitting flat, you knit all of your stitches from your left hand over to your right hand, and then you switch them back to your to your left hand. Well, there's none of that knitting in the round because you never, you're always just going round and round. It's like a big spiral.
That
Okay.
brings up a good point, though. Ooh, I can't find the question in the original chat now. Ronnie, yes, said she has a pattern for a blanket that calls for using a circular needle, but it's a blanket, so it's flat.
All right. So the reason they have you do items like blankets or maybe a large shawl on circular needles is because they're very long. And you don't want to have wooden or straight needles that are 3 feet long, because that would be very hard to take on an airplane, right? You'd be knitting in your living room and knock the lamp over. So you can use a circular needle that is, they usually come in sizes like 16, 24, 28, 32, 36, or 40 inches long. And that's the measurement from the tip of the needle to the tip of the other needle. Okay. So if you are making a blanket that is like 40 inches long and you have 14-inch straight needles, it's going to make it very hard to work on. But if you have a 40-inch circular, then you're going to be able to work on it very nicely, and it'll be easy, and you can lay it out and see how it's looking as you're going. So this is not knitting in the round. I'm going to show you, we talked about knitting in the round, where our yarn comes from our right hand, and when we knit the first stitch, it joins it. But if you want to knit a blanket, then we're not knitting in the round. So you turn it the other way. So you still can lay it out in the C to just make sure everything looks good. You don't have to worry if it's twisting, because it'll always be, separate, so you can untwist it. Just don't knit with your tail. And then all you do is you just knit the first stitch, just like normal, and then you keep going. Just normal knitting. And that's knitting flat on circular needles. So you'd still be going back and forth from front to back of your work. And so you just have to double check and make sure you're doing your stockinette stitch or your garter stitch correctly. The same way you learned when you knitted with flat needles. And what I recommend is, if you're making a blanket flat and you're using circular needles, after you start your row, you might want to put a stitch marker like 3 or 4 stitches in. And when you come to that stitch marker, you want to double check and make sure it's not joined. So you can see here it's not joined, because it's really easy to make a mistake. And when you get to the end of the row, you keep going round and round and you end up joining your work by mistake. That's a mistake a lot of beginners make. So every now and then, just pull it when you get to the end of your round, make sure it's not joined. And if it's not joined, then you're good for knitting flat on circular needles. And then what you do is I'm not going to do it for the sake of time, is you just knit all the way around. And then when you come to the end, you would just switch it and keep knitting back and forth. And when you try it, it'll make a lot more sense. Everything really with knitting makes so much more sense when you're doing it yourself and it's in your hand. Okay, does that make sense?
I think so, yes. I think we've had a couple questions on magic loop, so I want to make sure we cover that before the end of class here.
All set up for magic loop.
This is my favorite way to knit in the round, so.
This is my least favorite way to knit in the round. No, it's not my second least. I like double-pointed needles. I am a double-pointed needle.
Nope. Darren, we can't hear you when you don't talk to the camera.
Sorry. Okay, so magic loop. So with magic loop, you want to make sure that your cable on your circular needle is very flexible. You don't want to use a really stiff one. And most of them are pretty flexible nowadays, but you always want to double check, make sure it's very flexible, a little softer. Whatever size needle you're using. And then the pattern will tell you what to do, what size needle and what size yarn. And Once you've established what you're using, you'll just cast on whatever it says. So cast on, let's do cast on 20. And my yarn is all in a tangle. I'm going to cast on 20. Now the reason you need to use these techniques like magic loop or double pointed needles is because it gives you the opportunity to knit in a very small circle. So if you want to make fingers for a glove, if you want to make a baby sock, if you're making an arm for a tiny little teddy bear and you want to knit it in the round, you can't do that on great big needles like 16-inch circulars or 24-inch. You have to do that on, if you want to do it in the round, you can use double pointed needles or a magic loop. And usually people like one or the other better. Most people, I think, do like magic loop better. Don't you think so, Claire?
I think so, at least, you know, most of the knitters of my acquaintance like Magic Loop better. Probably because we're in New York City, so we used to commute a lot. And I feel like with double pointed needles, you always run the risk of one of those needles getting lost on the train, and then you can't knit for the rest of your commute.
Oh, that would be a tragedy. Okay. So cast on how many ever stitches your pattern says to cast on, and just cast them all on one needle, like you're just getting started. And you want to divide them in half, roughly half, unless if your pattern advises something else. Like again, if you're making a sock or something, it might want you to have so many on one and so many on the other. Okay, so what you do is you fold your needles in half, like this, and this is why you need a flexible cable. And you're going to bend your cable, and then you're going to pull it out like that. And then you're going to slide them down. And I'll do that again. This is what's going to get you started correctly. So there's my double pointed needle. My needles are here. And then you fold your cable in half with all of your stitches back there. And if you're just knitting a hat or a sock or something that you're just like the top of a sock and you're just going in the round, I like to just do about half and half on each one. Does that make sense? Let's see how I did that. And then you pull this loop, and what you want to do is have them on your needles, because that'll help hold everything together. So this is your home position. And as you're knitting with magic loop, as you're learning, you'll probably get a little confused. You'll be like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's going on. Whenever you feel that way, return to your home position, and that'll help get you balanced again. Okay. So again, as we did with double points and as we did with circulars, you want to make sure that your stitches aren't twisted. So here, you just want to make sure they're going straight. So twisted, again, I like to show people the wrong way so you can kind of have an idea of what could be wrong. That just doesn't look right. If you see that, you're going to know something is wrong. So straighten it out. But again, if you do it wrong, you have one more chance to fix it. And so then put your needles back in the home position. You take a hold of your back needle, the needle that's farthest away from you. You pull it. You see how I'm just pulling that out. And now I have a loop of cable on this side, and I have a loop of cable on this side. See, now I got myself all turned around and twisted. So what you're going to do then is, you see how my working yarn is really kind of coming from the right-hand side. And so when I knit my first stitch, I'm going to take my working yarn and join it here, and that will join in the round. That'll be my join. So what you're going to do is you're just going to enter the stitch just like normal. And unwrap your yarn and bring it through. And then you do want to kind of close up that gap. Pull it a little tighter. And then the second stitch, do the same thing. And once you get going, again, this is just like normal knitting. There's nothing special going to happen. So I'll go back and start that again from the beginning, but I want to show you this next step before. So were there any questions I can answer while I'm knitting across this needle?
We had a couple questions on why you might prefer magic loop versus double pointed needles.
What do you
which
think?
I said that yes. I mean, I feel like it's a lot of personal preference. Or if you're afraid of dropping your double pointed needles, with magic loop, you're only dealing with one needle that's connected to itself. So that takes care of that worry.
I like double points better because I get hung up with all these cables going round and round. Like I just feel like I'm going to tie myself up in them or something.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is personal preference, really, versus magic loop or double pointed needles. Or you can get very, very small or short circular needles. Like you can knit a sock on a tiny little 9-inch circular needle if you want to. There's a lot of different methods to get the same results.
Let me go back. All right, so I finished my row, and so you go back at the time. Every time you finish your needle, seeing that the stitch is completely off one needle, you want to go back to the home position. And my working yarn is coming from my right. Hold it like that. Then you pull this needle out and you position your yarn to do this knit stitch or purl, whatever you're doing. And then it's just like normal knitting at this point. I learned on double pointed needles first, and before I ever heard of magic loop, and I was really happy and comfortable with them. And then I have this thing, like if I really like, if I'm like, why do I need to learn double magic loop if I like double points? So I really never learned magic loop until much later on. And I guess because I learned on double points first, that might be why I like them better. I very affectionately refer to this method as the devil's ring, because I find it...
Seems a little unfair.
I know, but as the teacher,
yeah.
Most
I just want to say,
probably I would say 75% of knitters like magic loop better.
Yeah. And I know you were saying, you know, right needle front or right needle left needle. Sometimes I find it easier to think of it in my head as front needle back needle, since they're parallel to one another. So I would also say, you know, if you're having trouble remembering which needle your working yarn should be attached to pull out and start, that pull out the needle on the back, or the one that is farthest from you, and you're going to fold it over and connect it to the front needle.
Okay, so once you've finished your round, take the... It probably makes more sense to have the front and the back. I'm dyslexic, so right and left don't mean anything to me usually. So now it's very important, because I'm going to start my second round, and this is the last time we have a chance to fix it, is to make sure my stitches are all facing the same direction, and I feel like they are. So where's my working yarn? That's a good way to start each time. You know, where's my working yarn? It's on the front needle, or if you hold it like that, on the one on the right, however makes sense to you. And that's correct. So you pull out this needle, and then you just keep going. So I'm going to take this off and start it again. Is that a good idea? Do you want to see it again?
Yeah, let's see it again. And we did have a quick question, and people have noticed that you switch back and forth between knitting English style with the yarn in your right hand and continental style with the yarn in your left hand. I just want to let people know that any of these methods for knitting circularly will work with whatever method you use to knit. English, continental, Portuguese, whatever, they all work.
I got in the habit of when I'm demonstrating to do it both ways so people can
Yes.
see.
Yes, we have had a couple people say they appreciate seeing it continental too. So
that's the way I normally knit. It's kind of a continental method. I wrap my yarn with my left hand. I don't pick. So it's not exactly continental, but that's how I taught myself how to knit, and that's how I learned. Okay. So at this point, I'm just quickly casting on. Again, just whatever your pattern says, whatever needles or yarn you want to use for whatever pattern you're going to make that is appropriate. So just cast them on all on this one needle, nothing special. And then I'm going to trim this tail so I don't keep getting caught up on the tail. You would want to have a longer tail for weaving in your ends, but I just, for sake of argument, I'm just doing that to get rid of it. Okay. So there are my stitches. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide them, fold my needle in half so it's on the table. Just fold it in half, nothing really special at that point. So this is the only thing that's a little different. So you fold it, make that little loop, fold it, just divide them however you want. So you see how I'm just putting the half of them on one side and half on the other. So you just go like that. And then pull that ring out. So here's your magic ring, right? There's your magic loop. And then once you put them up on your needles, things tend to make a little more sense because the needles will hold everything for you and give it a little bit of structure. So my working yarn is coming from there. So I don't feel like that's right. So the working yarn, remember we talked about it coming from this side. So wait a minute. Okay, now, so when you do start, sorry, you want your working yarn in the back. You pull out the back needle, and then you're going to have loop on each side. And you just start knitting. So find your working yarn, get your working yarn in the right position. And then just start knitting like normal. It's not going to feel normal. And then pull it a little tighter, maybe the first two. Okay, so let's look at that again. Knitting these first couple of stitches. Okay, so we cast on. We cast on our stitches. So there's our cast on stitches. You slide them, fold your needles in half. So hold your tips together like that. Fold your cable in half. And then we're going to position our stitches so that they're on that where it folds. And this is why you want a flexible needle, because you have to bend it like that. And just put about half on one side and half on the other. And then pull them. And I said it wrong the last time, so that's why I wanted to show you the right way. So holding it like this, your working yarn when you're starting, your working yarn should be there. You pull out the back needle. And now I've got a loop on both sides. And you start knitting. Sometimes it helps if you position your working yarn before you enter the stitch, whatever's easy. So then you start knitting. And then once you finish this round, you can double check to make sure you didn't twist it or anything, or that you didn't, you actually did join it, like you didn't start knitting in the wrong direction. If you are knitting in the round and you do start knitting in the wrong direction the first time and you don't join it, sometimes you can continue on, like if you're doing ribbing and then the next round you'll join it, you'll just have a bigger, like little notch that you have to fill in. So as long as you're not messing up your stitch pattern, you can do that. Okay. Any questions about starting magic loop?
I asked for a roundup of some final questions since we are about 5 minutes over now.
Okay.
Let's see here. Oh, I gotta scroll back. Gail wanted to know, do patterns usually call for magic loop, or can you just substitute that? And how do you know when to do that?
Usually I find patterns will say knitting circular, like they are just like they'll just say you're knitting rounds. They won't say double pointed needles or magic loop. You just use whichever technique you're most comfortable with. Sometimes a sock pattern will tell you to have so many stitches on each needle for double pointed needles, but you can divide them up on a magic loop method, but just put stitch markers to distinguish where they're divided. Do you find that to be true, Claire?
Yeah, I think so. Usually for double point needles, like I see it most often for socks that have a pattern on them, or like, a lace or something, they'll tell you how many stitches for each needle. Otherwise, it's usually up to the knitter. They might specify which type of needle. Sometimes patterns will call for, a certain length of needle, and then you might be doing magic loop, but oftentimes it's up to the knitter to decide.
Yeah. And really, you just need to get really comfortable with one or the other, and then that's really all you need. You don't have to learn both. It's a good idea to try both to see which one you like better.
Yes, it's a good idea to try both, and that way, if for some reason one method doesn't work, you've got a backup plan. Let's see here. Ooh, Carol Mack wanted to know, is there a special circular needle to use for magic loop?
I'm not sure. Should we give name brands or okay?
I think the most important quality is that the cord is fairly flexible. So probably, like I see your needle's just got like a plastic nylon cording. That's usually what I use. I know there are a couple brands to have like a coated metal wire. You can certainly use that for magic loop. Personally, it's not my favorite because it wants to lay flat. And so when I folded the needle, it wants to like pop open and lay flat again.
Yeah. If you're buying needles specifically for magic loop and you're not sure, I would just try to look at the cable through the packaging. And if it's a thinner cable, it'll probably be more flexible. But if it's one of those thick cables, it's not going to be as flexible.
Yeah. We didn't get to it in any of our demonstrations, but binding off for knitting in the round, just like binding off for knitting flat.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think you'll have any problems with that once you get to that point. It's just normal, just bind off just like normal, however you like to bind off. No magic trick. Just remember you're always working on the front of your work, and if you want to bind off in pattern, sometimes that's good. So
yes. I want to thank everyone who came and stayed with us today. Just a reminder that the recording of this class will be available tomorrow at michaels.com/classes. We won't see you next week, but the following week, that is July 21st, we're going to have an Intro to Knitting Fair Isle class. If you want to go ahead and sign up for that, we will see you there. And then we might have some other classes in the works, so that'll all be available on michaels.com/classes. All right. right.
Thanks for coming to the class.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Have a great night. Practice. It takes a lot of practice.